can I get everyone's attention? Does that work? Yes. All right. Welcome to Or Books live on Avenue C. This is a series. Okay, I gave you all enough time to get quiet. So, my name's Olivia. I work at Or Books. Or Books is a small publishing house located in the back of the SPAR, the Francis Kite Club. We're back behind that projector. Feel free to come and check out the other books that we publish. They're all up on a beautiful display against the wall. So, Live on Avenue C is an event series that we started a little over a year ago, and it's a way to utilize this beautiful space that we're able to share to bring all of you in one room with our authors to promote provocative, especially in the case of tonight, discussions, productive ones, constructive ones. And tonight, our discussion is in honor of the release of this book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. I hope that all of you got a copy up front, by Norman Finklestein. This book was described by Cornell West as both brilliant and brave. I think we can say that Norman displays those attributes as well. And by Noam Chomsky as badly needed and done with Finkelstein's usual verve and precision. So hopefully you get your copy. And if you do, you're some of the first to get it because it actually hasn't published yet. And Norman will be in conversation with Briahna Joy Gray, who is the host of the Bad Faith podcast, which comes out 2 times a week. So if you haven't listened to that, you definitely should. She has conversations all the time, like the ones that they're going to have tonight. And she was also the press secretary for Bernie in 2020. So tonight we're going to start with a video that will be projected right there. I'm sorry for those of you that have to do a little bit of a 360. And then I'll invite Briahna and Norman onto the stage.
Let's first talk about your latest book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. What's your problem with cancel culture and what is termed woke these days?
For the longest time, I didn't have a problem with it. I just ignored it. It seemed to be another college fad, of which I had experienced many in my day. I went through the period of political correctness, or what we call PC, and it seemed just another version of that where people claim to be enlightened, the vanguard, and they're going to educate those who are suffering from all sorts of delusions and what we used to call back in the day false consciousness. So I didn't pay much attention to it. But then it became painfully obvious that it was politically a very pernicious phenomenon. And that was very blatant during the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primary runs of Bernie Sanders. The Bernie Sanders phenomenon was unique in my lifetime. It was the first class-based political insurgency in the United States since before World War II. And it demonstrated that we had reached a critical mass of Americans who were very dissatisfied with the way our system was unfolding. Indeed, they were so dissatisfied that mostly young people were willing to embrace a 78-year-old Jew from Brooklyn who called himself a democratic socialist. And this Bernie Sanders went on television night after night because he was a prominent figure in the primaries, denouncing what he called Big Pharma as a bunch of crooks, calling Wall Street a gang of crooks, naming names like Goldman Sachs, and his message was really resonating. And then lo and behold, these woke folks who are supposedly leftists and progressives and the cutting edge of radical politics, one after another, be it a Ta-Nehisi Coates, who denounced Bernie Sanders for being weak on the black reparations question, or Gloria Steinem saying, oh, those girls, they just go to the Bernie rallies to meet the boys. And Gloria Steinem was the icon of feminism. But at that moment, it became obvious that this was not just another marginal college fad or fad in academia, but it was a really pernicious force in our society, political force. And that then caused me to read some of the iconic texts of woke politics. And I reached the conclusion that at bottom, woke politics is a right-wing phenomenon. It has nothing to do with left politics at all. It's a instrument of the Democratic Party. See, the big difference between political correctness and woke politics is political correctness was really marginal. A few campus radicals. But the Democratic Party has instrumentalized identity politics. It's using identity politics to displace what was once its base, namely the trade union movement. And now, identity politics has real institutional force behind it, really formidable institutional force. Identity politics is the Democratic Party. Identity politics is the New York Times. Identity politics is the New Yorker magazine. Identity politics is Atlantic magazine. Identity politics has infiltrated most of what you would call liberal culture. And so its impact and the dangers it poses are much more significant than in my day with political correctness.
So identity politics as a lens through which to approach everything, whether on race, gender, but not class.
Right, well, I think that what you just said is the crucial point. To displace class. It's identity politics was always part of the left in the sense that it was considered on the left a matter of, it was just a natural thing. You were supposed to support the African American struggle in the United States. You were supposed to support the women's struggle in the United States. That was just part and parcel of being a leftist. Identity politics has appropriated those causes, the women's question, the Negro question as it was called in my day, but have lopped off the class element. I had to think twice, and I did think twice, and 3 times, and 4 times, because you have to remember, I grew up in the 1960s, okay, and 70s. And I experienced a complete overturning of values. You know, in my day, up until 1986, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and it was illegal to have sexual, what was called in the Supreme Court decisions, what's called same-sex sodomy. It was illegal. Women were homemakers. That's what a woman was. And there are 10,000 aspects of the society that I experienced, that I lived through, which were radically overturned in the course of my lifetime. I thought at the beginning of this whole wokeness phenomenon, maybe it was the same as in the 1960s. Conventional values are being overturned, and at some point, they will just become the norm. So I really was unsure, but once it became plain to me that something was seriously awry here, I had no problem at all saying that this stuff is completely crazy.
I think that's a good point at which to wrap us up. Professor Norman Finklestein, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, so I'm going to invite Briahna and Norman, who are in the back. And I also received news that there is a pizza pop-up. So for any of you who might be hungry, please feel free to get pizza up in the front. Try and do so without making too much noise, though. All right, Briahna and Norman.
All right. What an enormous pleasure and honor it is to be here with Norman Finklestein. I am not exaggerating. There is no hyperbole when I say I can't think of anyone who I enjoy interviewing more, dialoguing more with, whose intellect and rigor I respect more, and it's such an honor to be able to be in this space with him. I want to say as an anecdote, Norm, I was in New York last week and I came in from DC today, and my friends and I was visiting some law school friends. We were debating, as friends do when we get together, the finer points of the Gaza genocide. And the cab driver turns around and goes, "You know who you should really listen to on this is Norm Finklestein." And I say, fun fact, if you want, you should come downtown in a few days, and I'll be interviewing him on exactly that. So you are infamous and so broadly respected, and you give a voice to so many who find themselves overwhelmed by the overwhelming gist of mainstream dialogue on this issue. So I just want to say thank you right off the bat.
Well, thank you, and it really is my pleasure to be on with Briahna. I have just a whole lot of respect, not just for her intellect and her personality, though I do appreciate that she laughs at my jokes. But it took a very special toughness this past year for Briahna to assume the role that she did, because it was, for those of you who watched her program Rising, it was day after day, Briahna would not relent. And it was plain as day to anybody watching it that at some point something had to break. This could not go on. Her co-host, you can almost see him at a certain point imploding and just begging and pleading, please stop. Please, Briahna, stop this. Briahna, you are destroying this program, you have become a verbal pyromaniac. And Briahna is black, and she is a woman. And it was not easy for her, in my opinion, it was not easy for her to just relentlessly, and you might say ruthlessly, attack Israel and what Israel was doing. And as I said, it really did take a special kind of courage, and Briahna is smart enough to know, as she told me later, that this could not last. I knew that I was, to quote the title of a book, I knew I was burning that bridge, and she persisted. It was very impressive. Actually, the three best programs over the past year were by women. It was Briahna Joy Gray, it was Katie Happer, and it was Crystal Bull, all three of whom were relentless, courageous, really impressive. So, and Briahna's just very smart, so it's always a pleasure, though she can be contrarian.
Me? Norman Finklestein saying that I'm contrarian. I need to talk about this with my therapist.
I think at the end of every program I'm on with her, I think, why did she have to do that?
Well, we're both a little bit dogs with a bone, so we'll see where this takes us this evening. One area where we very much agree, and we've had a lot of simpatico over the years, is in our critiques of identity politics. From my perspective, I tend to characterize it as the weaponization of identity politics as opposed to just the identity politics themselves, because of course you can define identity politics as simply having a concern about the discrete issues that are germane to a given identity group, that are real and legitimate and material, and advocacy to reform whatever those problems are on the basis of those identities, of course, is not a problem in and of itself. The problem is the way that it is weaponized and twisted by something like the Democratic Party in order to disguise the lack of substantive material offerings they have for those discrete groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, there's been interesting ways in which this current political moment, both because we're in this second Trump term and also because we're in this bipartisan, very pro-Zionist environment, that identity politics has been validated in some ways and undermined in other ways. So a trend tweet that you might have seen is something along the lines of conservatives, people who are critiquing identity politics, generally speaking, across the political spectrum, saying, I miss woke because the Department of Education gets defunded, or I'll take woke over Trump's tariff regime that threw the stock market into a spin. You'll have people who are elites who are so mad about their stock portfolios that they'll say, oh gosh, I miss wokeness, right? And on the other side, you have this illustration of the failures of wokeness, the negative aspects of wokeness, when you see the exact same arguments instrumentalized in favor of Zionism. And I wonder how you've perhaps thought differently about your critiques of wokeness now that we're in a very different political environment than the sort of Obama era in which a lot of these concerns arose.
Well, to begin with, I'll state the obvious, that whole woke phenomenon has suffered a major blow, perhaps even a lethal blow, since the election of President Trump. The Democratic Party thought it had a vehicle that would bring them into the White House, namely this hyper focus on the wokeness. There was a period where it was just hard to even believe what you were reading in the New York Times with the support they were lending to, for example, George Floyd demonstrations, even giving some support to the toppling of the statues at the end of the George Floyd phenomenon. And that's over. A realization has set in that that vehicle, namely the woke politics and the identity politics, that vehicle has reached an impasse. It's not going to succeed. So how do I feel about it? I guess I'll try to be concrete rather than abstract. I'll make some basic observations. It was very interesting to watch what happened in the spring of this, a year ago now, almost exactly a year ago now, because you had not one, not two, but you had 3 Ivy League presidents toppled by the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. It began with Mr. Ackman at Harvard, and it turns out I had just read, and we're going to get to it later, I just read the Harvard Task Force reports, and in the one on anti-Semitism, it mentioned that 2 of the first critics of Claudine Gay, they had each, or I should say respectively, one had given $200 million to Harvard, the second had given $300 million to Harvard. And by that standard, even Bill Ackman, who led the attack at Harvard, he had given only a mere $50 million. Now, why do I bring it up? Because we were in the era of wokeness at that point. Claudine Gay was a black woman. At the U of P, it was President McGill, who was a woman. And then at Columbia, it was President Shafiq, who also was, as the expression has it, a woman of color. And their woke bona fides did not save them. They were all toppled very quickly, and there wasn't a peep of dissent or defense of them by the Democratic Party, by its outlets like the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine. They were dead and gone. And that to me was very revealing about just how committed these institutions actually were to the woke agenda when push came to shove. When push came to shove, Ms. Gay, Ms. McGill, and Ms. Shafiq Hoot were thrown under the bus. In terms of the current situation, I would say the following. In my opinion, and here Briahna and I obviously can disagree, I do believe that there was a serious problem with wokeness in higher education. There was a serious lack of tolerance of dissenting points of view in certain disciplines. There was in my opinion, a profound distortion of certain disciplines, a watering down of those disciplines, which above and beyond all else was a profound disservice to the students. They were being fed, if I could say it, they were being fed garbage in the classroom. There was this woke, apparatchik attitude. And students, apart from the handful of social justice warriors, were not happy with what was going on in the classroom. So it began in the spring with the Jewish supremacist billionaire class going after the encampments. Let's never forget that did not happen under Trump. That happened under Biden. For those who have a memory that reaches back a year, the threats of deportation began under the Biden administration. The suspensions, the expulsions, all of that was under the Biden administration. However, it's also true that the Trump administration, while still actively pursuing the totally bogus war on anti-Semitism on college campuses, and that's still the core of it, is being promoted by the Jewish supremacists, the billionaire class. It's true, he expanded the target. It's now not just anti-Semitism, he's expanded the target to all those woke courses, woke so-called disciplines, which are not only authoritarian, but they are intellectually vacuous. They have no intellectual content whatsoever. They are buzzwords and slogans devoid of intellectual content. So he went after that because it wasn't difficult. There was a lot of dissatisfaction on the college campus with those classes, those courses, those so-called reading lists that were being provided. So, in my view, there was a real problem. But I do not accept that it's the Trump administration that should be breaching the basic principles of academic freedom as they pretend to solve the problem. Just as a simple piece of education, academic freedom means fundamentally one thing. Fundamentally, it means that only your professional peers are qualified or competent to judge your qualifications and your competence. It began as a principle to rid the universities of the influence of religion, because it began in Germany. Germans were establishing what they called research institutes, which were pursuing truth, pursuing science, and religion was a constraint on that pursuit. So first, we want to get religion out of the university. In our country, at the beginning of the 20th century, the second challenge came from not the billionaire class, but from the class that was called back then the robber barons. And the robber barons did not like that a small handful of faculty were sympathetic to the incipient, the burgeoning workers' movement. So we want to get the capitalist class out of the university so we can pursue truth. And then came the McCarthy era, where it was the state that wanted to limit speech. So I do believe, even as I was not a beneficiary of academic freedom, I was not. I am 71 years old, and I never had a job. That's not a joke. I never had a job. I was what you call an adjunct, which means you get paid sub-minimum wage to teach classes which were always overflowing. However, even as I was not a beneficiary of academic freedom, I still strongly believe the basic principle. If you want to teach physics, it should not be J.D. Vance who decides your qualifications. Same with biology, chemistry, and same in the humanities. So the dilemma became the wokeness had infected a large part of academia. Academia was not doing the housekeeping that it should have done. And then it enabled the Trump administration to intervene, but I absolutely oppose it. It has to be an internal process, and there has to be a serious reckoning with this disaster that has set in the past decade or so, this utterly empty, vacuous content. And a large part of what I wrote in the book is simply to go through the iconic texts to demonstrate there is just nothing there.
I think that what makes this issue slightly complicated for someone, especially in the context of not only the arguments that figures like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are making about what's being taught on campuses, but also the kind of arguments that are being deployed in the sort of Harvard task force letter context, that there's some parallels there, and they're all taking aims at a certain kind of academic lens that has been described as woke. And I'm not talking about Ibram X. Kendi. I'm talking about, I think, more substantive academic lanes, like what they call like the oppressed framework. Every time you turn on the TV and hear a conservative commentator bemoaning woke, so often they'll say, these pro-Palestine students, they see everything in terms of oppressed and oppressor, and therefore you can't take anything that they say seriously. CRT, we all got a crash course on critical race theory, or didn't actually, but we were told that it was this boogeyman that was the predecessor to woke, that encompassed everything absurd, I think, that you've rightly criticized, like some of the lists that were promulgated largely in an HR context, I would say, not in an academic context. okay? Sorry, I slightly lost my train of thought. Okay, so there's CRT, we were told it was woke, and there were all these things that were promulgated in an HR context that were like timeliness is white culture and expecting people to show up on time. And that sort of is easily parodied and absurd, right? But there's also real, substantive scholarship. That is CRT, the real CRT, I would argue, in a critical legal studies framework. And the fact that not only are these right-wing advocates taking aim at the idea that there are power dynamics in the world and that colonialism is a thing and a lens that you should use to evaluate various circumstances. And also in the Harvard Task Force, I don't know if you noted that, they specifically take aim at the fact that some of the polarization on campus is a consequence of students adopting that framework for looking at the world and therefore seeing, yes, the occupation of Palestine is a big problem, is something that they need to have more academic neutrality in both siderism around. So do you have any concern? I think for me, at least, the concern is validating a framing that would lump in what I think are constructive frameworks for evaluating the world, including Palestine, with some of the absurdity, which, again, I think was mostly, not that it was never raised its head in academic circumstances, but was largely a bastardization of like academic ideas in an HR context. That by conflating all of these things, you're kind of paving the way for venom against woke that is really more pernicious. It's venom against an academic philosophical lens that allows you to describe power dynamics and imbalances in the world.
Okay, first of all, just some background because we can't assume everybody knows the references we're making. There was a Harvard task force on two issues. One was on anti-Semitism, what it called anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias. And then there was a second task force on anti-Arab, anti-Islam, and anti-Palestinian sentiment at Harvard campus. And each of those task forces, there were two of them, issued their reports about last week. The one on anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias ran to about 311 pages. The one on anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian bias ran to 220 pages. I would say the one on anti-Semitism should have been entitled the Harvard Task Force on Jewish Naval Contemplation. By the end of the report, I have to say, with all due respect to Briahna and her alma mater, I didn't give a flying fig how anybody felt at Harvard about anything. You feel unwanted, you feel unsafe, you feel this and you feel that. I mean, if you read the Harvard Task Force on Anti-Semitism, I'm really surprised they didn't go to the International Court of Justice and charge genocide for what they had to endure or what they claim they had to endure. Now, having said that, to the specific questions that Briahna brought up. Number one, this kind of wokeism at Harvard was very fringe. They never really talk much about the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It's these fringe aspects. For most of you probably know, higher education now is a business. And so as a business, they create all of these continuing education, general education, all of these satellites which are taught. Actually, the whole thing began at NYU because NYU was always a business, or at least when it was taken over in the 1990s, it became just a business operation. I used to call it NYUNY, like DKNY. It was just a brand. And they started to create all these spin-offs, and it was a wonderful idea, because if we'll take Harvard now, Harvard, students get to say they studied at Harvard. They didn't study at Harvard. They studied at one of these silly, flaky satellite campuses.
When it's like the Olsen twins got a degree from Harvard,
Yeah,
or I think Tyra Banks got one too. That's what it is. No shade.
Yeah. And Harvard was making a mint off of its brand because all the students want to be able to say, I got my degree at Harvard. And the adjuncts, like myself, were paid slave wages to teach in these programs. No exaggeration. In the 1990s, to teach a course there, you got $1,500. $1,500 to teach a course.
For a semester.
Yeah, for a semester. Yeah. It was lower paid than even CUNY. In any event, so most of the wokeness was confined to like one program that the task force talks about. It's called Religion and Public Life, RPL. It's a division of the Harvard Divinity School. It was, I hope there's nobody here who got a degree from there and is going to be peeved at me, but it was plainly unserious. And then there was a couple of programs at the Harvard School of Public Health, which came under attack. When you read, when you read the descriptions of what went on in the classroom, it was really woke. We're going to de-Zionize the Jewish mind. We're going to decolonize. You know, it was like just crap. So I'm not going to defend any of that, but I don't think it was representative of anything.
And in fact,
And it was also, by the way, it was these courses were all taught by what are called, quote, non-ladder faculty. What non-ladder faculty means is you're not in a tenure track job, you're just a loser with a PhD, and you're looking to teach anywhere, which was what I was. If I were in Cambridge, I probably would have taught in one of those flaky satellites. So I'm not going, when I was reading it, I said, uh-oh, this does sound like wokeness. I don't like that syllabus. I don't like the intolerance. I don't like the authoritarianness. So I'm not prepared to defend it, but I don't think it was a significant phenomenon. But there was one thing that was very noticeable. Very noticeable. And here I'm going to toot my own horn to paraphrase Hillel, if I don't toot my horn, who will? Isn't that what Hillel said? Something like that. So, one of the hallmarks of the wokeness was they did not like the idea of freedom of speech. They didn't think it was a good idea. You know, they came up with all of these highfalutin theories about speech acts, and they called Derrida and Lacan and who the hell else, and who the hell cares. And so they wanted to replace the principle of free speech. They wanted to substitute for it a new formula that you can stifle and suppress speech if you, meaning a particular oppressed group, you felt unwelcome, unsafe, or uncomfortable. That was the standard. Forget free speech. We're going to set up a new woke standard. Oppressed groups have the right to suppress speech which causes them to feel unwelcome, unsafe, or uncomfortable. Now, it happens, for those of you who have purchased a copy of the book hot off the press, on page 37, I say directly to Palestinians and their supporters, I say, folks, don't go down that path, because it's very predictable what's going to happen. You say that Israeli speaker makes me feel unsafe, unwelcome, and uncomfortable, and therefore he or she should not have the right to speak. And I said in the book, it's only a matter of time before the other side says, we don't want any Palestinian speakers because they make us Jews feel unsafe, unwelcome, and uncomfortable. And now, if you open up the Harvard Task Force report on anti-Semitism, every other page, Jewish students feel unsafe, uncomfortable, and unwelcome, and that's why there's a problem of anti-Semitism at Harvard, because of how Jewish students feel. They appropriated all the woke language and then weaponized it in order to crush the dissents on Harvard campus, but elsewhere as well. It was an easily predictable disaster in the making. The left has historically fought for expanding to the maximum the boundaries of free speech. That's a hallmark of the left tradition. And that tradition was traduced by this woke culture which replaced free speech with our hurt feelings.
So Norm, I'm glad we landed here, because I think this is the crux of my ambivalence. Abstractly, in a lot of contexts, the left talks about the importance of defending speech rights. We reference the KKK walking through a community of Holocaust survivors and having to defend their right to do so because eventually they'll come for us and we need it to be tit for tat. But in practice, devil's advocate, in practice, what we're seeing play out as it's played out on these college campuses is that there might be these rhetorical opportunities and sort of a political openness to a kind of woke left, post-Obama, sort of pro-diversity influence. And you'll get someone like Roxane Gay after 400 odd years of Harvard's existence becoming the first black president, dean of the university. She lasted 6 months and was immediately toppled because power spoke more than principle. And my experience—
Just for clarity, Roxane Gay?
Sorry, Claudine Gay.
Yeah.
I do that every time. Roxane Gay is a journalist who's like her cousin,
I know.
and I have a weird brain tick about that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Claudine Gay. And my experience in school during, I guess, the woke era— I mean, I haven't been in college for like 20 years, but my experience in school was that while I think we were in a liberal— well, it was like the Bush era, but we were in an increasingly liberal moment in terms of what was socially accepted, and it certainly wasn't what we're experiencing now when Republicans are trying to rebrand Martin Luther King as bad, actually. You know, it felt like a more progressive time, even though it was a Bush era. Or I was in law school during the Obama era. It felt like while culturally there were some victories, institutionally, it was very conservative. And while some conservative might feel like their views weren't validated in the classroom, and the task force memo kind of acknowledges this. The university structurally and the opportunities professionally outside of the universities all mitigate in favor of the more conservative student, whereas the benefits, the cultural benefits, the community benefits of adopting a more woke approach to life only exist within the confines of the university and specific departments, and most of the activism coming out of those woke communities is applied on campus. So protesting wages of university staff, those kinds of things, and was very rarely directed into the real world. That's all to say the power of the woke was purely rhetorical and very limited, was representational a la Claudine Gay becoming president, and was ultimately short-lived because the second the real money and power spoke, in the context of the Bill Ackmans of the world, we saw how superficial it all was. So similarly, in the task force, they also talk about, you said, well, at the very least we have these academic principles where your academic merit should be vetted by your peers, and we should stand by that principle, and that should put some guardrails on this whole thing. Well, the task force also contemplates having more restrictions on who actually gets staffed and viewpoint diversity on the people in the Arab Studies department. The implication being that everyone in the Arab Studies department is like Israel is an occupier and is in the wrong. Therefore, we got to hire some new folks so we have viewpoint diversity. So you're going to get to a place, arguably, where your peers are being pre-selected for having views that aren't necessarily academically validated, but are politically validated. And so at every turn, it does seem at the end of the day, as much as we can and should stand by these generic principles or broader principles, how do you deal with the fact that in practice, all of the kind of complaining about the woke was about a couple of college kids with blue hair who might have said some crazy things, whereas on the other side, you have presidents and vice presidents actually stripping funding from universities. You have students being deported. You have tenured professors being kicked out of school. And you have this Columbia student that was just wrestled down and brutalized by campus police yesterday. How do we make these arguments in the realm of principle when the reality of the power dynamics seem to suggest that the principle of the thing is insufficient to protect our rights?
Look, I said I did not benefit from those guardrails, so it's kind of paradoxical that I would now be supporting the system of what's called academic freedom. 9 times out of 10, we are going to lose because the system is rigged against those who vigorously dissent from the dogmas of those who control the system. However, it's a question of, if you're a person of the left, you're trying to reach a broad public, and you're trying to make a plausible, credible case so that in some instances, just a few, I acknowledge, you actually have the possibility of winning. So I said, Briahna's totally correct. I mean, the heart of these institutions, there was very little wokeness except for, a black face instead of a white face, a female face instead of a male face. Yes, in the core of these institutions, they let these people in Complet or a lot of these other majors. They were able to seize power in these majors and produce a vast accumulation of gobbledygook. There was a time when in my free hours at night, I watched British murder mysteries. Now when I have run out of them, I watch Judith Butler lectures just to amuse myself, trying to mentally unwind before bedtime. However, having said and granted everything Briahna just said, I still believe you could have made, or we could have made, a more credible case in the spring and now if we had simply said, let me give you, I try always to be concrete. As I told one of my students who's here this evening, I said, you have to always go from the abstract to the concrete or you lose your audience. So let's take a concrete example. That infamous slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Personally, I don't like the slogan, but that's totally irrelevant to the issue at hand. The slogan was first denounced at Harvard by none other than Claudine Gay, the woke president of Harvard. She was the first one to denounce it. What should have been the response? Listen closely, in my opinion. I'm asking you to listen closely. I'm not ordering you to listen closely. Our country has a very impressive, and I'm not a flag waver, and right now my parents would probably be filled with revulsion at what I'm saying. Our country has a very impressive record on the books when it comes to free speech. So listen, in our country, the Supreme Court has ruled you have the right to advocate the violent overthrow of your government. You have that right to advocate the violent overthrow of our government. I know that to be true because in my Maoist youth, I was advocating the violent overthrow of the government every day of every week, of every month, of every year in our newspaper, The Guardian. And guess what? Are you ready for this? It never even crossed my mind that I would be arrested. It was just taken. We understood we had that right. In our country, we have the right to burn the American flag. That case came before the court in 1989. It's a very interesting case to read because the dissent in the case was written by the Chief Justice Rehnquist. And he wrote this very long dissent, and he said, it's our flag. It's our flag. And he talked about Francis Scott Key. I'm serious. He then recited a poem by this woman named Barbara Fritzsky. It was 2 pages in his dissent. And he was obviously, and I can get it because I feel the same way about the red flag. He said they raised the flag at Iwo Jima. They marched into battle carrying that flag. And now he says to the majority on the court, you're saying they have the right to desecrate it. And the court said, yes. That's what we're saying. It's symbolic speech. It's expressive conduct. It's protected in our Constitution, the First Amendment. And then there was the series of rulings in the case of Skokie, Illinois. 70,000 people lived in that community. 40,000 were Jewish, and a small but significant number, in the hundreds, were Holocaust survivors, survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And along comes the Nazi Party, which it's forgotten is also legal in our country, just as the Ku Klux Klan is legal in our country. You may not like it, but that's our country's tradition, history, jurisprudence. And along comes the American Nazi Party, and it says it wants to march through Skokie. And as you can imagine, the Jewish community felt very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, unwelcome with the Nazis marching through it. Now, that case went through 3 court hearings: the Eastern District Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, and not only did they find that the Nazi Party had the right to march, they found that the Nazi Party had the right to wear its military regalia. And then it went to the Illinois Supreme Court, and they ruled the Nazi Party had the right to wear the swastika. And they said the bedrock principle of our First Amendment jurisprudence is you cannot suppress speech that offends. You cannot suppress speech that is offensive. Now, had that history been recited in the spring, any observer would have said, well, if we as Americans have the right to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, if Nazis can march through Skokie, if anti-Republicans have the right to burn the American flag, then from the river to the sea is small change. It's nothing. You may like or you may not like the slogan, but in terms of our own constitutional history, our jurisprudence, it's nothing. And that would have been, I'm not saying we would have won.
And in fact, we didn't, right?
No, because
people who, of course, were pushing back on the
allow me to complete the
basis.
thought, and then you have the stage. We didn't win because we lost the language. We lost the language. We had been using the standard of unwelcome, unsafe, and uncomfortable. And they ran with that language. We had used the language of free speech and say, hey guys, do you know what our Supreme Court has ruled? Just to give you an example, when Professor Shafiq was at the congressional hearing, President Shafiq from Columbia, when she was at the congressional hearing, somebody commented afterwards, and it really struck me. Somebody commented, do you know what were the 2 words you never heard President Shafiq say? The 2 words? She never said academic freedom. She never uttered it. She could have said to Stefanik, Ms. Stefanik, you attended Harvard. You don't know what our Supreme Court has ruled?
But why do you think Shafiq and none of the others made those kinds of arguments? We were referring to them as woke on the basis, basically, of their identity. And I have some issue with that conflation because all of those presidents ultimately weren't woke at all in terms of actually advocating for Palestinian interests, even standing up for basic constitutional principles. They all sounded insane during those hearings. and like marble-mouthed, you know, nothings. Certainly not esteemed professors who I'm sure are very intelligent to get to where they, well, maybe we're very intelligent to get to where they are. Because I would argue they were concerned
Totally agree.
about the donor base and not saying anything that would be offensive to them. And so when you're making bad arguments, and as an intelligent person, the same way that I often argue about the Democratic Party, at a certain point you have to open yourself to the possibility that they're losing because those good arguments aren't available to them. Because they're being directed by something other than their intellect or what they know is correct legally or any other kind of moral or intellectual framework. So what do you do with that? And does it benefit us to lean into the characterization of these people who are ultimately tools of the moneyed interests that we're so critical of the left as woke simply because they are minority women or just women? Are we in some ways participating in that fiction and doing a sort of, you know, racecraft of our own by adopting that terminology?
Well, I agree with Briahna that these folks, part of the reason they didn't use the language of free speech is because, A, they were never committed to defending the rights of students, to defending the anti-genocide encampments. I agree with that. I also agree with Briahna that the main factor at that point was the donor issue, the Jewish supremacist billionaires. It's very striking that when you read the two reports on anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias, and then you read the report on anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian bias, when you read the two reports, the first report makes a half-sentence mention of the billionaires who gave $200 and $300 million to Harvard, and then not another word about that. In 311 pages, not another word. When you read the other report by the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinians, every other page, those donors, they are dictating what's happening on our college campuses. So I agree with what you say. Don't have expectations of these presidents. Ultimately, they are responsive to their donors because the main job of a college president is fundraising. That's not a joke, that's a fact. They are hired to fundraise. That's their job description. And secondly, hey, they like the system. They're beneficiaries of it. Here are these women of color who are now leading our major institutions. I'm talking about us, the left, what, in my opinion, we should have been saying to bring to light, which I suspect comes as a surprise even to people in this room. Because when I say things like, you know, our Supreme Court has had this issue about advocating the violent overthrow of the government, and it's been an issue for the court since the early 1900s, when the anarchists and the communists, a lot of them foreign-born, you know, people like Emma Goldman, came over here. This issue, do you have the right to advocate the violent overthrow of the government? A lot of people nowadays have no idea about that. They're completely shocked.
Minority.
And I think we have a real responsibility to retrieve that tradition and also to rid ourselves of a vocabulary, a political vocabulary, which has proven to be a complete and total disaster.
I would just say this. I interviewed, a Harvard Law professor, Nico Bowie, on the podcast a couple years ago when Biden was doing his sort of performative Supreme Court reform, committee. And he's also the son of, I think, one of the good law professors we had, Lonnie Guinier, who also got railroaded out of the Clinton administration, if you recall, for being basically too progressive, and what might be described as too woke, although I think her scholarship was very substantive. And the point that he made was this: we have this sort of mythology in our head that the Supreme Court is this last bulwark defending our rights. But if you actually look through the history of Supreme Court opinions, 9 times out of 10, it comes down in favor of corporate elites, the powerful, et cetera. And occasionally you have what are very outlier cases, like, let's say, Roe or Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board is even controversial in and of itself as to how full it ultimately was. And it's frankly a mythology. And when you talk about a principle like you're allowed to advocate for the overthrowing of the government, and you point to the KKK, there's other people who will say, yes, the KKK has been allowed to persist and has never been threatened in any real way by the government. And in fact, there's some crazy statistic that's like the FBI has focused 90%, let's say 85% of all of its COINTELPRO investigations against left groups.
You have to tell them what that is.
That the Black Panthers have been assassinated and firebombed out of existence and infiltrated out of existence, whereas the same sort of attention has not been paid to the KKK. So what does it mean? This is just a question. What does it mean to have these principles when, in fact, the power as applied by the state is very asymmetrical and doesn't follow the broad principle as it's been outlined, including at a constitutional level, and that's even before we are facing the skewed composition of the courts that we're now looking toward in the Trump era?
Look, you make use of what you have, and you're always trying to expand the borders, the boundaries of what you have. Those happen to be, Briahna's right, most of the court decisions bearing on issues like big business are a complete disaster, except I don't remember how many cases went before the court during the Roosevelt era, the FDR era, and there must have been some cases that went before it during the Lyndon Johnson, the war on poverty era.
But remember, very importantly, that Roosevelt had to bully the court into doing what he wanted to do.
But I'm just saying, those are, in my opinion, the decisions I refer to. And I have to admit, I'm going to be honest about these things. I'm old enough to remember the Skokie decision. And I was totally opposed to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, because the ACLU defended the Nazis in Skokie. And given my family background, that did not resonate well in my home, to defend the right of the Nazis. And interestingly, even in the decision by the court, I'm referring to the Skokie court, they said, and I'm quoting them now, we know that many Jewish survivors in the community of Skokie are going to be tormented, that's the word they use, tormented by the sight of these Nazis marching through Skokie. And at the time, at that point in my life, I was against it. It took a long time for me to understand, both as an intellectual principle, that you cannot allow persons' feelings to veto the right to speech. That's an intellectual principle. And as a pragmatic principle, it's a disaster to use people's feelings as the test of whether a particular speech should be expressed, allowed to be expressed. Now, if amidst all of this horrible Supreme Court jurisprudence, you have a few good cases that you can use, I cannot see the point of abandoning or rejecting those few victories. We have to always remember one fundamental fact. Professor Chomsky was often praised for, quote, speaking truth to power. And Professor Chomsky always rejected that. He said, we don't need to speak truth to power. Power already knows the truth. We don't have to tell them. They don't give a damn because they like the system. We're speaking not to power. We're speaking to what the Occupy movement called the 99%, who have no power and they have no wealth. We're speaking, more honestly, it's about 80%, and we're trying to reach them. And in my opinion, one way to reach not the powerful, but to reach your fellow citizen, comrade, whatever you want to call it, is to invoke, as I said, I'm not a patriot, but you know what? In the past few weeks, I sat down and I read through the decisions. I was curious. The Skokie decisions, the flag. I have to say, they were damn good. The reasoning was it was not quite, it was very impressive. Now, obviously, you're going to have to accept things that maybe you don't like. For example, if you are consistent with that tradition, yes, Nazis have the right to march through Skokie. And there are going to be a lot of ugly things that you're going to have to swallow. But ultimately, there are two tests, and then Briahna goes.
No, well,
There are two tests.
we'll open up to
Test
questions.
number one, if you are truly committed to the pursuit of truth, if you're truly committed to the pursuit of truth, and it is my opinion, and it has not always, but for a long time been, our strongest weapon is truth. That's why they wanted to crush those encampments, not because they were raucous, not because they were uncivil, not because they were threatening. They wanted to crush those encampments because they were broadcasting a very ugly truth. So, if you're committed to truth, then I don't see how you can justify suppressing speech on the ground that it hurts feelings. And as a pragmatic matter, it's a complete disaster when you start going down that route, because the moment you use the standard of feelings, remember, the people in power get to decide whose feelings we're going to protect. And as Nadine Strassen, the former head of the ACLU, in a little book called Hate, she made the point, if you look into legislation all across Europe, all that anti-hate legislation, all across Europe. She says if you look at the results of that legislation, it was all weaponized by the governments to silence the very groups it was supposed to protect. And that's just what's happening now. It's being used, all the anti-hate legislation is now being used to silence the very groups, in this case Palestinians and their supporters, that it was supposed to be, or wokeness told us, would protect them.
Okay. I'm going to open this up to questions. I feel remiss in not just letting you speak very briefly on, I think, a part of the book that is ripe for questioning, which is how you pedagogically, as a professor, deal with this question of feelings. Because in your book, in chapter 7, you write that while you are obviously now making this argument, that it is not the most effective argument to, allude to your feelings of being unsafe, safetyism, to justify your right to say protest on Columbia's campus. It is in reality an obligation that a professor has to balance in the classroom of creating an environment that promotes engagement and participation, and the reality that there are topics that might be particularly alienating or might kind of undermine the self-esteem of various students. Or in the current context, there might be people in the room that have served, let's say, in the IDF and literally been instruments of violence. You might be sitting next to someone who's quite literally killed Palestinians or countrymen, your relatives, et cetera. Just to the last point, though, I would say I think the question isn't whether we give up on the constitutional protections, but whether we should be clear-eyed on the fact that those constitutional protections are very limited and have given up on us. And while it is nice that the Supreme Court protects the right of a Nazi to walk through Skokie, it is in fact, it's not a one-for-one, because a lot of the campus debate discussions are in a sub-constitutional private institution norms and regulation space and not in a constitutional protection space. But if so many of the fights are in those kinds of spaces, what do those constitutional protections do for us anyway? And if power and money is what dominates the outcomes in those spaces, is the reliance on constitutional protections sort of misplaced? And do we have to adopt other strategies as the left to protect ourselves in effect? But that being said, I want to give you a chance to briefly just talk about what you've struggled with in the classroom.
Yeah,
and
I
then
think
open it up.
Sometimes there are real life dilemmas and there are no ready answers. So if you read both Harvard reports, the two reports, they both end on the same note. The note is what they call pluralism and, what was it, pluralism and,
Sorry, the Harvard note, what is it called?
wait, pluralism and, oh God, I'm just slipped my mind. Inclusiveness, pluralism and inclusiveness. And they said we have to make a campus where everybody feels part of the community. We have to be inclusive. We have to be pluralistic. And you get the idea. You can't say things like Israel's committing genocide because that's not inclusive of the Jewish students.
And in fact, the report uses the language, it's a report on anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias.
Yes.
I would argue that one of those things is not okay, and one of those things is like a moral obligation,
So, so the purpose behind this slogan of pluralism and inclusiveness, it's another assault on free speech. That to me is clear. What's really going on is Jewish students, Israeli students, they have to feel welcome. They have to feel part of the community. And if it happens that they support genocide, No, I'm serious. If it happens that they support genocide, well, we have to find a nice compromise or have a nice conversation about it. Briahna thought the gas chambers were a great idea.
Wait a minute. Things get clipped very easily.
Norman thought they were a bad idea. So, in the spirit of NPR, let's try to find some common ground. That's the report. And that part is completely wretched. They have one example they give. There's a Harvard professor, I think the author of the report, Mr. Penslar, Professor Penslar, and he says, I have a great new course I've designed. We're going to have a course in which we will have the Jewish fanatical settlers, we're going to read their letters in the 1970s. And then we're going to read the experience of those whose land is being taken. And of course, we're going to be viewpoint neutral, and we're just going to hear both sides. Well, to my mind, that's like, we'll read the diary of somebody at the gas chamber, and then we'll read the Jewish person in the camp, and we will be neutral, or we'll try to find common ground. There's something wrong with that. There's something wrong. However, for those of you who have attended my class or classes, which means almost nobody, for those who have attended, I make a very desperate effort, and I'm very firm about it, that we have to hear out everybody. There can be no silencing of opinion in my class. But then there's the question, what happens if you have students in your class, which is very realistic? The Harvard Task Force says a large number of the Jewish students now attending Harvard are either Israeli Jewish or they have relatives in Israel. It seems like the indigenous Jewish component has diminished, and it's now a large part Israeli Jewish attending Harvard. Am I supposed to be neutral if this quite, not just possibly, quite probably, child killer is in my class? Am I supposed to be neutral about that fact? For every Israeli coming out of Gaza right now, for every Israeli member of the IDF coming out of Gaza now, the default setting is that person is either practiced or complicit in genocide. That is the default setting. He or she is either a murderer or, say, participating in the denial of food, fuel, water, and electricity in Gaza. That person, the default setting, I am sorry for those who believe in the principle of innocent until proven guilty in all circumstances. As a general principle, it's valid. In the case of Gaza, it's guilty until proven innocent. And it will be the rare, rare person who will be proven innocent if he or she served in Gaza since October 7th. So, I admit it's a moral dilemma. Should I, as hard as I try, and I come down, let's say, this past semester, there was a student who was defending the right of a country to kill prisoners of war, because after all, war is about killing the enemy. That's what the war is about. And he says, why should we keep the prisoners alive? They're a drain on resources. Why shouldn't you have the right to kill them? And then another student from the other side of the room shouted out, you sound like a Zionist. I said, you want me to lose my job? No. I said, well, I did say that, but that was a joke. I said, no, that's not an answer. That's a reasonable argument. You may not agree with it, but any argument that has ideational, that's just a fancy word for there's an idea there, any idea that has ideational content has to be answered. It can't be shut down. So I am very firm on that principle. But I recognize, and here I will again, if you will excuse me, invoke the memory of my family. They would be disgusted if I pretended to be neutral when a child killer or child starver is sitting in my class. And as I said, there are some questions which, alas, I don't believe there is a coherent answer to.
I'm getting the rap. It's really hard though, because the elephant in the room, I think, is that your defenses of debating Holocaust denial. And I would also raise that one of the questions that has been the focus of woke criticism has been people from other marginalized groups in class who feel like certain discussion topics impugn. I mean, this is where we get to what counts as feeling unsafe. Is it literally an IDF soldier sitting next to you in the room?
This is not
anything short
it's
of
not
that?
a question of being unsafe. It's a question of being morally neutral and arbitrating a discussion, or not arbitrating, fielding a discussion or facilitating a discussion with somebody who is a murderer sitting in that class. I recognize there's a problem there. For those of you, and there's just a tiny number in this room, there used to be a program in the 1960s, Deborah Winger, if she were awake, would remember it. There was a program in the 1960s called Firing Line. And it was hosted by our country's our best-known conservative. His name was William Buckley. A nasty piece of work, okay? And then he would have always on formidable opponents. He did not choose flakes. He had strong opponents. He had Noam Chomsky on once. He learned his lesson and never had him on again. But for example, on the question of the war in Vietnam, he had on a person named Allard Lowenstein, who was this anti-communist liberal who ran on the platform. He ran for president at some point, opposing the war in Vietnam. He didn't run. Either he ran or he supported Eugene McCarthy. I can't remember now which. In any event, they would argue about the war, Buckley for the war, Lowenstein against the war. Buckley for the war, Lowenstein against the war. And it was very heated, and it was very exciting, and made for great TV. And then, at the end of the debate, they would get up and hug each other. They would hug each other. And my parents would look at it. Hugging him? The country of Vietnam was turned into an inferno. He's using his national platform to promote the war, and you're hugging him? You're being inclusive? There is, and I internalized that lesson when he debated the famed radical lawyer, William Kunstler, and he debated Chomsky, Professor Chomsky. At the end, they just sat like this. No love lost. No hugs. And I ponder what should be my attitude in the circumstances that were being described in the reports. I do believe everybody should have the right. I believe it's useful. The class is very dull. It's very dull when everybody has to recite the same woke dogmas. It's very boring. So it's useful to have the dissenters. But should you be morally inclusive of them? A lot of the Jewish students in the report say they were being shunned. They were being shunned. Well, you know what? If you support the genocide, I think you should be shunned.
All right, we're going to leave it there. There's another act coming on at 8, I'm told, but thank you all for coming, and thank you, of course, Norm Finklestein, for another amazing discussion.
My favorite.
All right, hard to summarize that one. I think we'll have to have Norman and Briahna dialogues published at some point. So we're going to do a quick turnover. There is music that is formally starting at 8:30, but we met the musician at the start of this event. And it turns out that she is releasing a song today that is about Palestine. And she wanted to play it after the culmination of this event. So the artist who is in this room, her name is Bushra Al-Sadi, and her project is called Sadi. And the song that she's going to play for us to kind of wrap things up is called Cowboy in a Ghost Town. It's going to take about 5 minutes for us to switch over to the music stage, so please grab some pizza over there, grab a drink. If you have to go, we understand. Hope you stay for the music, and thanks again for coming out.